In a high-stakes Senate hearing room, Vice President JD Vance and retired investigator Robert Coville confront 81-year-old Senator Dick Durbin over a billion-dollar oversight failure that allowed a massive pandemic relief scheme to run out the clock. He had announced his retirement on April 23, 2025, at a news conference in Taylorville, Illinois. In a video, he had clearly thought about it carefully, speaking with the specific, considered weight of a man making a statement he has rehearsed until it says exactly what he means. He had said, "The people of Illinois have honored me with this responsibility longer than anyone elected to the Senate in our state's history." He had said, "I truly love the job of being a United States Senator." He had said, "But in my heart, I know it's time to pass the torch." He was 81 years old, and he had been a United States Senator since January of 1997. He had been a member of Congress since January of 1983. This was 43 years in the national legislative branch, which made him, at the moment of his retirement announcement, the longest-serving popularly elected senator in the history of the state of Illinois. He had been the Senate Democratic whip since 2005. That was 20 years as the second-ranking Democrat in the upper chamber of the United States Congress. He carried the specific, sustained institutional authority of someone who has been central to the management of his party's legislative enterprise. This enterprise had endured through 8 presidencies and multiple shifts in the balance of national political power. He had chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee from 2021 to 2025. This was during the period when the Democratic majority controlled the Senate, and his committee had the full authority of the chairmanship. This included the ability to schedule hearings, issue subpoenas, demand testimony, and compel the Department of Justice and its component agencies to account to the committee for the conduct of their investigative and prosecutorial functions. In September of 2022, during the first full year of his chairmanship, the United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota had made an announcement. They had announced federal charges against 47 individuals in connection with the Feeding Our Future scheme, describing it as the nation's largest pandemic relief misappropriation network. By October of 2022, the number of charged individuals had reached 70. The scheme had been described as organized, large, and still expanding. The investigation noted that the techniques developed in the Minnesota programs were being observed in other states and other federal benefit programs. The Senate Judiciary Committee had statutory oversight jurisdiction over the Department of Justice and its prosecutorial functions. Dick Durbin had been the chairman. He had been in a room in Dirksen 226 on the morning of March 20, 2026. This was for the last time as a member of a committee that would not exist for him after January 2027. The Senate Judiciary Committee's special session on federal prosecutorial accountability and congressional oversight of major investigations had been organized by the committee's Republican majority. It had the specific, documented purpose of examining what the committee had and had not done during the 4 years of the 117th and 118th Congresses. This was with respect to the Minnesota ecosystem and its federal prosecutorial response. The session was titled an ethics hearing. It was an ethics hearing in the institutional sense, meaning that it addressed the ethical obligations of congressional oversight, not the ethical conduct of individual members. However, the distinction in the specific framing of the morning's proceeding was narrower than the institutional language suggested. JD Vance had requested the opportunity to address the committee in his capacity as Vice President and Constitutional President of the Senate. This was a role that provided him with the procedural standing to appear before Senate committees as a special presenter when the committee's chairman and the rules of the session permitted. Chairman Tom Tillis had granted the request. J.D. Vance had prepared for the session with the specific, biographical, and analytical precision of a man who had grown up in a community where the gap between what institutions claimed and what they actually produced was not an abstraction. It was the material condition of daily life. He had spent the subsequent 20 years of his education and professional life developing the analytical tools to document that gap. He did this with sufficient precision to make it undeniable in rooms where it was typically allowed to remain comfortable. Dirksen 226 was a hearing room that had seen everything. It had been the room of the Watergate hearing, of the Thomas hearing, of the Bork hearing, of the Kavanaugh hearing, of the Jackson hearing. It was a room with a specific, accumulated institutional weight that belonged to the specific, accumulated history of the things that had been decided there. By 9:00 inches the morning, the gallery was at capacity. The press section was dense with the specific attention of journalists who have identified a proceeding as historically significant before it even begins. The cameras were at their stations. The overhead lighting was the flat, document-grade warmth of a room organized for the permanent record. The stenographer was at her machine. The air had the compressed quality of rooms where the proceeding is consequential, and the people in it are carrying their full institutional weight into the space. Outside, it was the gray of a mid-March morning in Washington. It was the specific gray that had been the city's ambient weather for the preceding 3 weeks. Since the beginning of Operation Epic Fury and the concurrent domestic accountability proceedings that had been running simultaneously with the war. Durbin arrived at 9:48, with the unhurried dignity of a man who has been in this room for decades. He has no remaining need to establish himself as a presence within it. He was 81 years old, and he had been in this specific room for significant events too many times to feel the room's weight as anything other than familiar. He set his folder on the table. He adjusted his microphone with the practiced ease of someone who has adjusted Senate hearing room microphones for more than 40 years. He sat with the specific, settled composure of a man who has decided that the proceeding he is about to participate in will be the proceeding he has chosen to give. His composure is not performed ease, but genuine, late-career institutional authority. Durbin had been born in East St. Louis, Illinois, on November 21, 1944. He grew up in a working-class family that understood the specific, material meaning of what public institutions either do or do not do for people without economic insulation. He had attended Assumption High School. He had earned his bachelor's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in 1966, and his law degree from Georgetown Law Center in 1969. He had worked as legal counsel to Illinois Lieutenant Governor Paul Simon. When Paul Simon had retired from the United States Senate in 1996, Durbin had run for Simon's seat. He won it, and he had held it for 5 consecutive terms. He had banned smoking on commercial airline flights in 1987 as a House member. This was a piece of legislation whose impact on public health had been measured in reduced deaths from lung cancer and other smoking-related diseases across the decades that followed. He had written the DREAM Act in 2001 alongside Orrin Hatch. This was a piece of bipartisan legislation whose passage had been blocked for years before its provisions were enacted through executive action in the form of DACA. This action had protected over 800,000 young immigrants from deportation. He had been a major force behind the First Step Act in 2018, which had reformed federal sentencing guidelines and provided incarcerated people with more opportunities for re-entry programming. He had confirmed 235 federal judges as Judiciary Chairman, including Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman to sit on the Supreme Court. He had announced his retirement on April 23, 2025. At a news conference in downstate Taylorville, he had said it was time to pass the torch, and he had meant it. He was in this room on March 20, 2026. He was there because the record of his chairmanship had one more proceeding to complete before the torch was passed. He had chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee from January of 2021 to January of 2025. This was during the exact 4-year period in which the largest pandemic scheme in American history had grown from detectable to a national scandal, all under the oversight jurisdiction of his committee. He sat with the specific, organized authority of someone who knows this proceeding is not a continuation of his legacy, but an examination of a gap within it. He has decided that the examination is something he will face directly, rather than manage procedurally. He was 81 years old, and this was one of his last hearings. The room was full, the cameras were running, the stenographer was ready. The record would hold whatever was said in the next 3 hours, exactly the same way it had held everything else from this specific room across the decades. Durbin had been coming to it. He adjusted his microphone. He sat. JD Vance was 41 years old. Before he was vice president, he had been the author of a memoir that had made him famous before it made him a political figure. It was a memoir about growing up in Middletown, Ohio, in a family that had been shaped by the specific, generational, documented failures of institutions to serve the communities they claimed to serve. These were failures that Vance had experienced personally. He described them with the specific, biographical, non-rhetorical precision of someone who had been inside those failures as a child and had spent the subsequent decades developing the analytical vocabulary to describe them accurately. He had gone to Ohio State and then to Yale Law School. This was the specific, improbable trajectory of someone from Middletown, Ohio. He had used the institutions available to him to acquire the tools that the examination of those institutions required. He had worked in venture capital. He had run for Senate. He had been elected. He had become vice president. He had been in rooms like this one before, in different capacities. He had come to this specific room because the question he had organized the morning around was a specific one. It was the question of what happens when the people with the largest institutional authority and the longest institutional tenure make specific, documented choices about which oversight questions to prioritize and what those choices cost when the clock runs on a billion-dollar scheme. In the third row of the gallery, in the left-center seat, was a man named Robert Covville. He was 63 years old. He was a retired special agent of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. He had spent 28 years investigating complex financial cases in the Northern District of Illinois, which was the federal district that encompasses the city of Chicago and its suburbs. This placed him squarely in Dick Durbin's home state and in the constituency of the senator who had represented Illinois in the United States Senate since the year after Covville had joined the IRS. He had worked financial cases for 28 years. He had worked wire cases, Medicaid cases, healthcare cases, bank cases, and tax cases. He had built cases from financial records and had sat in rooms where prosecutors explained what the documents meant. He had watched juries understand what the documents meant. He had seen people face consequences for the things the documents showed. He had retired in 2021, the exact same year that Dick Durbin had assumed the chairmanship of the Senate Judiciary Committee. He had spent his retirement in Springfield, Illinois. This is Durbin's home base. He had followed the Minnesota investigation with the professional attention of someone who spent nearly 3 decades making the same kind of case. He understood from that professional experience what the pace of an investigation communicates about the institutional commitment behind it. He had watched the Feeding Our Future indictments begin in September of 2022. He had tracked the subsequent months and watched the network continue to operate in multiple programs, while the investigation moved at the pace it moved. He had written a letter to Durbin's Senate office in March of 2023. He identified himself as a retired IRS criminal investigation special agent from Illinois. He asked what the Senate Judiciary Committee, which had oversight jurisdiction over the Department of Justice, was doing to examine the progress and adequacy of the federal investigation into the Minnesota network. He had noted in the letter that, in his professional experience, the gap between the scale of a network and the speed of the investigation was a gap that destroyed the recoverable portion of the proceeds. Every month the network continued at operational scale was a month whose losses were not recoverable, even after resolution. He had received, 6 weeks later, a form letter from Durbin's Constituent Services Office. It thanked him for contacting the senator and noted the senator's commitment to effective law enforcement. He had written again in November of 2023. He had received another form letter. He had driven from Springfield to Washington at the invitation of the committee's majority staff. They had found him through the network of retired federal law enforcement agents who had documented their own responses to the investigation's timeline. He was wearing a navy blue blazer. He had the 2 form letters in his breast pocket. He had a 2-page summary of the timeline of the investigation and the timeline of the network's growth alongside it. It showed, with the specific, professional precision of someone who spent 28 years building financial timelines, exactly what had happened during the years when the network continued to expand after the first charges were filed. Chairman Tillis called the session to order at 1:00. He recognized Vance for his opening presentation. Vance said, "Chairman Tillis, Ranking Member Durbin, members of the committee." He said it with the specific, unhurried, biographical clarity. That was his characteristic beginning. It was the voice of a man who grew up in Middletown, Ohio. It was the voice of a man who wrote a memoir about his grandmother, his mother, and his community's relationship with institutions that promised things they did not deliver. He has spent the subsequent 20 years of his professional life developing the capacity to examine institutional performance with the specific forensic precision that the examination requires. He said, "I want to begin with something that I believe most people in this room will agree with, which is that Dick Durbin has had a long career in public service that contains genuine, documented accomplishments." He said the law that ended smoking on commercial airline flights saves American lives every year. He said the First Step Act was bipartisan criminal justice reform that had real and measurable effects on sentencing policy. He said the 235 federal judges he confirmed as Judiciary Chairman represent a significant and consequential use of the committee's institutional authority. He said, "I want to say all of that clearly and mean it, because what I am about to ask is a different kind of question, and I do not want the question to be misunderstood as an attack on Senator Durbin's overall record." He said it is not an attack. He said it is an examination of the specific, documented use and non-use of institutional authority during a specific 4-year period, by the specific person who held that authority during that period on a specific subject that this committee's statutory jurisdiction made his responsibility. He said in September of 2022, the United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota announced federal charges against 47 individuals connected to the Feeding Our Future scheme. He said the press release described the scheme as the nation's largest pandemic relief misappropriation. He said 47 indictments in a single announcement. He said the United States Attorney said this is not an isolated scheme. He said the network had grown to an estimated $250 million in the child nutrition program alone by the time the first charges were filed. He said by October of that year, 17 additional individuals had been charged. This brought the total to 64 defendants in one state, in one ecosystem, in less than 2 months. He said this was public knowledge. He said this was in the press. He said the Senate Judiciary Committee, whose statutory function includes oversight of the Department of Justice and the United States Attorney's offices that operate within it had access to classified briefings about the investigation's scope and trajectory in addition to the public record. He said, Senator Durbin was the chairman of that committee at the time. He said, I want to ask what the committee did with that information. Durbin said, Vice President Vance, I appreciate the acknowledgement of the legislative record, and I want to engage with your question directly because I believe it deserves a direct answer. He said it with the calm, organized authority of a man who has spent decades managing adversarial Senate proceedings. He knows the difference between a question that is designed to produce a non-answer and a question that deserves engagement. He said, the Feeding Our Future network was a criminal matter, being actively managed by the United States Department of Justice. He said, the Senate Judiciary Committee's oversight function in active criminal investigations requires a careful balance between the committee's legitimate oversight interest and the operational integrity of the prosecutorial process. He said, when an active criminal investigation is underway, the committee's aggressive public intervention can compromise the investigation's ability to build cases and secure resolutions. He said the committee made a deliberate judgment that the investigation needed to proceed through the proper channels rather than being subjected to the specific operational disruption that high-profile congressional oversight hearings can produce in active criminal matters. He said it with the organized, analytical precision of a 40-year institutional veteran who has spent decades making exactly this kind of judgment call, and who believes the judgment was defensible. Vance said, Senator Durbin, I want to engage with the argument you have made about the risk of disrupting active investigations. He said, it is a real argument, and it has genuine merit in some circumstances. He said, I also want to note where I believe it does not apply to this specific situation. He said, the concern about disrupting an active investigation applies to oversight actions that would compromise the investigation's operational security, reveal confidential sources, or alert subjects to the investigation's scope before actions can be taken. He said, none of those concerns apply to the committee's oversight of the adequacy of the investigation's resourcing, pace, and prioritization. He said the question of whether the United States Attorney's Office in Minnesota had sufficient resources to investigate a $250 million scheme was vital. He asked whether the Department of Justice was appropriately prioritizing that investigation and whether the regulatory vulnerabilities that allowed the network to scale from detectable to enormous were being addressed at the federal level. These are all oversight questions that do not compromise investigative security. He said they are questions about institutional performance, not operational tactics. He said the Senate Judiciary Committee can, and does, ask those questions without interfering with active proceedings. He said, I want to ask what the committee's output was on those specific questions between September 2022 and January 2025. He said it with the patient, organized patience of a man who is distinguishing between two different oversight functions. He refused to allow the conflation of them to serve as an answer to the specific question he is asking. Durbin said, Vice President Vance, the committee's oversight work during that period was substantial and covered a wide range of subjects. He said, I want to be direct with you that a comprehensive accounting of the committee's specific output on the Minnesota investigation as a distinct oversight subject would show limited, direct public engagement with that specific investigation as a standalone committee matter. He said, the committee's oversight priorities during the 117th and 118th Congresses were organized around what we assessed to be the most consequential threats to the rule of law and democratic governance. During that period, This included significant concerns about the integrity of the judicial nominations process, the oversight of immigration enforcement, the examination of domestic extremism, and the institutional integrity of the Department of Justice itself. He said the Minnesota network was a serious matter. He said it was being actively addressed by DOJ. He said the process was producing results. He said the committee's judgment was that the process was the appropriate mechanism for accountability. Congressional hearings on an active multi-year proceeding would be duplicative of the process rather than complementary to it. He said it with the controlled, organized honesty of a person who has decided that the straightforward acknowledgement is more defensible than the strategic evasion. Vance said, "Senator Durbin, I want to accept the acknowledgement that the committee's specific output on the Minnesota network as a standalone matter was limited." He said, "And I want to examine what limited means in this specific context." He said, September of 2022, 47 indictments. He said, one state, $250 million. He said, October 2022, 64 defendants. He said the network continued to operate in multiple Minnesota Medicaid programs through 2023 and into 2024. He said the Housing Stabilization Services Program had been paying out $21 million per year when it started in 2021 and was paying out $14 million by 2024. He said the EIDBI autism program had been impacted by an amount that federal investigators believed could approach $1 billion in total across all programs when fully assessed. He said the United States Attorney described Minnesota as a national poster child for public malfeasance. He said every year between 2022 and 2025 was a year in which the network continued at operational scale. He said every month the network operated at scale was a month in which people were diverting money intended for hungry children, autistic children, and disabled adults. He said, I want to note one specific number that I think is the most important number in this proceeding. He said the United States Attorney's Office, in the Feeding Our Future case alone, documented that approximately $250 million had been diverted. He said of that $250 million, as of the most recent assessment, approximately $75 million had been recovered. He said, $75 million. He said, out of $250 million, he said, which means $175 million of money misappropriated from programs designed to feed children has not been recovered and is not recoverable. He said it was spent on luxury hotels, casino trips, and real estate in Kenya and Somalia. He said, it is gone. He said, and that is only the Feeding Our Future case. He said, across all Minnesota programs, the full estimated total approaches $1 billion, with a recovery rate that is lower than 30%. He said the portion of that money that was not recovered is not recoverable. He said it was the specific mathematical product of the clock running on the network's operational phase. He said, Robert Covville, who spent 28 years investigating financial records in Illinois, wrote to your office in March of 2023 and noted specifically that every month the network continued at operational scale was a month in which the recoverable portion diminished. He said he wrote again in November of 2023. He said he received 2 form letters. He said, I want to note that Robert Covville is in the 3rd row of the gallery. He said the name with the flat, patient, documentary quiet, with which he said every important name in every important room. He said, Robert spent 28 years as an IRS criminal investigation special agent in the Northern District of Illinois. He said he is from Illinois. He said he is your constituent. He said, Robert wrote to your office in March of 2023 identifying himself as a retired federal financial agent and asking what the Senate Judiciary Committee was doing to examine the pace and adequacy of the federal investigation of the Minnesota network. He said he wrote again in November of 2023. He said he received 2 form letters. He said, Robert S., professional judgment, based on 28 years of building financial cases, was that every month the network continued at operational scale, was a month in which the recoverable portion of the proceeds was diminishing. He said he noted that in his letter. He said the form letter did not engage with that specific professional assessment. He said, I want to ask you to address Robert Covville directly. He said, I want you to tell him what the judgment was that led the committee to prioritize other oversight work, while his professional experience was telling him that the clock was running on the network's recoverable portion. In the third row, Robert Covville sat with the 2 form letters in his breast pocket and the timeline in his hand. He sat with the complete, focused attention of a man who spent 28 years building documents into cases and who is now in a room where the documents he built are being entered into a different kind of record. He was 63 years old. He had spent his career in the specific, methodical, evidentiary tradition of federal financial investigation. It is the tradition that knows that a scheme's life cycle has a window within which the damage is recoverable, and that the window closes faster than most oversight processes respond to it. He had written the letters because the professional knowledge was in his possession. The professional obligation to report it to the people who could act on it was the obligation that 28 years of service had made automatic in him. He had received 2 form letters. The institution that could have acted on his professional assessment had sent 2 form letters. He sat with the specific, patient attention of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask the question that his timeline documents. When Vance said his name, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. It was the specific shift of a room in which an abstract argument has been given a face, a biography, a profession, and 2 form letters. The press section was very still. In the first row of the gallery, 2 people who had come separately and did not know each other were both doing the exact same thing. They were writing in small notebooks with the absorbed attention of people who have identified a sentence they intend to use again. Robert Covville sat with his hands flat on the timeline and waited for Durbin to address him. Durbin was still. It was the specific, genuine, hard stillness of an 81-year-old man who has received a question he cannot fully answer, and who knows it. He is in the visible interval of the silence, deciding what to say that is both true and complete. The silence lasted 11 seconds. It was not the theatrical silence of a moment that has been arranged for effect, but the honest silence of someone evaluating the real distance between what he did and what the situation required. He said, Robert. He said it with the specific weight of a man addressing a constituent by name in a federal hearing room at the end of a 40-year career. He said, I want to speak to you directly because I believe you deserve a direct answer. He said, you are a retired federal investigator who wrote to my office with a specific professional assessment about the timeline of the Minnesota investigation, and you received 2 form letters. He said, that is not the response your professional assessment deserved. He said, it should have been reviewed by someone on my committee staff with the specific knowledge to evaluate it. He said, it was not. He said, I want to be honest about why. He said, the committee's oversight bandwidth during the period you wrote was being organized around what we assessed as the most consequential institutional threats of that moment. He said, and we assessed the Minnesota network as a matter that the prosecutorial process was handling. He said, we were wrong about that assessment. He said, not wrong, that the process was handling it. He said, wrong about what handling it meant for the question you were raising. The question was not whether the process was happening, but whether it was happening fast enough to preserve the recoverable portion of the proceeds. He said, "That is a different question from whether the process was adequate, and it was the right question. The committee did not ask it, and the form letters were the specific institutional consequence of not asking it." He said it with the full, compressed, late-career honesty of a man who has spent 40 years in public service. He has decided that the last significant proceeding of his public career will not be the proceeding where he chose the comfortable answer over the accurate one. Vance said, "Senator Durbin, I want to note what you have just said, because I believe it is the most significant statement made in this room today." He said it without emphasis. He said it with the flat, documentary precision of someone noting a fact. He said, "You have said that the committee was wrong about the assessment and that the form letters were the institutional consequence of the committee not asking the right question." He said, "Those words are in the record." He said, "And I want to add one more specific, documented fact to the record beside them." He said the United States Attorney for the District of Minnesota, in his public statement about the scale of the network, said that the state had become a national poster child for public malfeasance. He said the FBI director said the charged cases were the tip of a very large iceberg. He said the full estimated value of the network across all Minnesota programs is approximately $1 billion. He said $1 billion was diverted in various stages and over several years from programs designed to feed hungry children, house disabled adults, and provide autism therapy to autistic children. He said the Senate Judiciary Committee, during the period of your chairmanship, had the authority, the jurisdiction, and the institutional tools to examine whether the federal response was adequate. He said it did not specifically exercise those tools with respect to this network. He said Robert Covville's professional assessment, submitted in March 2023, was that the clock was running. He said the clock ran. He said it quietly. He set both hands flat on the table. He said 40 years of public service contains a great deal that was done well and done right. He said it also contains this. He said both are in the record. The gavel came down. The room held the specific, complicated silence of a proceeding that has produced an acknowledgement from someone at the end of a long career. In the last hearing of consequence he will sit in, it contains something true and painful about the gap between a committee's enormous institutional authority and the specific way that authority was and was not used. In the gallery, Robert Covville sat for a moment after the gavel, with the 2 form letters in his breast pocket and the timeline in his hand. He was 63 years old, and he had spent 28 years building cases from documents. He had come to Washington not to prosecute Dick Durbin, but to put his professional assessment in a room where it could be answered, rather than form-lettered. It had been answered, and the answer was in the record. He stood from his seat slowly and walked toward the gallery exit. He was not triumphant. He was not relieved in the simple way of someone who has gotten what they came for. He was in the specific, more complicated state of a person who has received the acknowledgement that the right question was not asked. This is not the same as receiving the earlier action that would have resulted from asking the right question. He understands the difference between those two things with the professional precision of someone who spent 28 years knowing what the difference cost. The form letters were in the record. The acknowledgement was in the record. The money that was diverted and not recovered was also in the record, in the form of the numbers that the investigators published and the U.S. Attorney described in the documents. Documented, all of it was in the record together. That was what the record was for. The aide from the majority staff said, "He said it." Covville said, "He said the committee was wrong, and the form letters were the consequence of not asking the right question." The aide said, "Is that what you needed to hear?" Covville thought about this with the methodical patience of a man who spent 28 years evaluating testimony for what it contained and what it withheld. He said, "In financial investigation, we talk about the statute of limitations as the clock that defines whether you can act." He said, "But there's another clock, the one that measures how much is recoverable." He said, "I wrote those letters because the second clock was running." He said, he acknowledged it was running. He said, "The form letters were the consequence of not asking the question." He said, "That S in the record now." He said, "The money that was recovered is the money that S recovered." He said, "The rest is what it is." He said, "But the record has to hold what happened." He said, "It does now." He said it with the specific, settled, non-triumphant quality of someone who has achieved not what he wanted, which was earlier action, but what the remaining circumstances permitted, which was the documentation of what earlier action would have required. He walked toward the elevator. He had a flight home on Saturday. He had a garden in Springfield that needed the late March attention that Illinois gardens require in the specific transitional weather of late March. He had a career that was behind him and a record that was accurate and complete. He went home. Durbin walked out through the members' corridor at 1217 and stood in the marble hallway for a long moment. He was 81 years old, and he had been in this building for 43 years. He had confirmed 235 federal judges. He had ended smoking on airplanes. He had shepherded the DREAM Act provisions, the First Step Act, the Affordable Care Act, and 100 other things through the specific, grinding institutional machinery of the United States Senate. He had built a career whose length and scope were, by any standard of institutional measurement, remarkable. He had also chaired the Senate Judiciary Committee for 4 years. During that time, the largest pandemic scheme in American history had grown from detectable to a national poster child. His committee had sent 2 form letters to a retired agent from Illinois who had written with a professional assessment about the clock. The clock had run, and the money that was in the ground at the end of the running clock was not recoverable. He thought about Paul Simon, his mentor and former employer. This was the man whose Senate seat he had won, the man who had taught him the specific, difficult, unglamorous work of doing the job carefully and in full. Paul Simon had taught him that the Senate's oversight function was not a political tool or a rhetorical exercise, but a genuine accountability mechanism. Its value was proportional to the seriousness with which it was applied. The temptation to reserve the committee's attention for the proceedings that made the best news was the temptation that most consistently produced the institutional failures that made the worst news later. He had believed that. He still believed it. He had not applied it consistently enough to the Minnesota network. The application that was missing was the specific, professional, clock-sensitive application that Robert Covville had been asking about in 2 letters. That was a true thing. He had said it in the room. He would have to live with having said it, which was different from the way he had been living with having not asked the right question. He had said, "I know it's time to pass the torch." He still meant it. The torch he was passing carried the full record of what he had done, and what he had not done, and what the gap between those 2 things had cost. That was what a 4-3-year record looked like. There was no version of a 4-3-year record. That was only the good things. He walked toward his office. He had meetings to attend and calls to return in the specific, daily work of a United States Senator in the final year of his final term. This was the work of making the remaining time count, in whatever ways the remaining time permitted. He walked. The clock was still running on the parts of the record that had not yet been fully accounted for. That was the permanent condition of institutional service. That was what 43 years had taught him. You do what you can do with the time you have, the authority you hold, and the assessments you make. Then, the record holds what you did not do, and what the gap between those two things cost. The record holds it accurately, permanently, and without regard for the balance of the career that surrounds the entry. The record holds all of it. That is what it is for. That is what it has always been for. Some senators serve for 40 years and leave a legacy that is indisputably, documentarily real. Some of those senators are also the chairman of committees that receive form letters from retired federal agents while the clock runs on a billion-dollar network. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. The record holds both. It holds the 235 judges, the smoking ban, the DREAM Act provisions, and the First Step Act. It holds the 1-second silence, the 2 form letters, and the acknowledgement that the committee was wrong about the assessment and that the form letters were the consequence of not asking the right question. It holds all of it together in the specific, permanent, non-editorial form that the record takes when the gavel comes down. The session ends, the cameras are packed, the gallery empties, and the stenographer closes her machine. The document moves from the present tense of a proceeding into the permanent tense of the record. Robert Covville drove home to Springfield. The clock had run. The money was what it was. The record was what it was. The acknowledgement was in the record. That is where accountability lives. It always has. It is the only place it can live. Some senators serve for 40 years and leave a legacy that is indisputably, documentarily real. Some of those senators are also the chairman of committees that receive form letters from retired federal agents while the clock runs on a billion-dollar network. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. The record holds both. It holds the 235 judges, the smoking ban, the DREAM Act provisions, and the First Step Act. It holds the 1-second silence, the 2 form letters, and the acknowledgement that the committee was wrong about the assessment and that the form letters were the consequence of not asking the right question. It holds all of it together in the specific, permanent, non-editorial form that the record takes when the gavel comes down. The session ends, the cameras are packed, the gallery empties, and the stenographer closes her machine. The document moves from the present tense of a proceeding into the permanent tense of the record. Robert Covville drove home to Springfield. The clock had run. The money was what it was. The record was what it was. The acknowledgement was in the record. That is where accountability lives. It always has. It is the only place it can live. JD Vance walked out through the corridor and stood for a moment in the hallway. He had come to this room not to diminish a 40-year career, but to put in the record the specific documented gap within it that the record required. The gap was in the record now. The acknowledgement was in the record. He had been in rooms like this one before, and he had learned from those rooms that the most important moments are not the moments when someone collapses. They are the moments when someone tells the truth about a difficult thing in a room where telling the truth costs something real. Durbin had told the truth. The committee was wrong. The form letters were the consequence of not asking the right question. That truth was in the record now. It sat beside the 40 years of genuine accomplishment, and it did not diminish them. It completed them. A 40-year record that contains only the good things is not a complete record. It is a selective one. The full record holds the gap. The full record is the accountability. The accountability is what the oversight function exists to produce. The record holds it now. That was the only thing that needed to happen this morning. It happened. The clock that matters now is the one that measures what comes next. The record holds what was said and what was not said. and what the 11 seconds of silence contained, and what came after the silence. The record holds Dick Durbin saying the committee was wrong. It holds Robert Covville saying the record has to hold what happened. It holds JD Vance saying the clock ran. All three sentences are in the same document. The document is the accountability. The document endures after the career's end and the sessions close, and the torch is passed. The record is the only torch that never goes out. It was burning in this room on March 20th, 2026. It will be burning when the final testimony from this week's hearings is cited in the proceedings that come after it. It holds everything. That is what it is for. That is what it has always been for. The record endures. The committee was wrong about the assessment. Those 5 words are in the record of a United States Senate Judiciary Committee hearing. They were said by the man who chaired that committee during the 4 years the assessment was being made. They sit beside 40 years of genuine, documented, consequential public service. They sit beside 2 form letters from a retired IRS agent in Springfield, Illinois. They sit beside $1 billion and $75 million recovered, and $175 million not recovered. They sit beside the developmental windows that closed, and the children who receive billing when they should have received therapy. All of it is in the same record. The record holds it all. That is the permanent, honest condition of accountability in a democracy. The torch is passed. The record holds what the torch illuminated. The rest is what comes next. The next is the obligation of the people who inherit the record. The people who read the record, the people who build the next set of oversight priorities on the foundation of what the record shows was done and left undone in the years before. The record is the inheritance. The inheritance is the obligation. The obligation belongs to the institution that continues after the 4-0-year tenure's end, and the sessions close, and the gavels come down for the last time. The institution is the Senate. The Senate is the room. The record is what the room produces. The room produced this on March 20th, 2026. The committee was wrong. The clock ran. The record holds it. That is enough to begin the next chapter. It has to be enough. It is what the record contains. That is what the proceeding produced. That is what the proceeding was for. The proceeding was for this. The accountability was for this. The record is for this. The clock ran. The committee was wrong. Those sentences are in the permanent document of a United States Senate hearing. They belong there. The institution required them. They are there now.